So this week's module is about deviations from baseline, claims, liquidated damages, what happens when things don't go according to plan. There is a limit to how much productivity you can get out of a human being. Some people have a higher threshold than others. The diagram here kind of illustrates that regardless of what your hours you're able to put in to a week, your performance or your productivity level has a limit. So at the peak of this curve right here, that would be the limit of your performance. Beyond a certain number of hours per week or a certain number amount of stress, you start losing productivity. So that leads to things like distress, exhaustion, ill health, and ultimately a breakdown. There is a certain amount of stress is good for people. And it is kind of up to you as an employee to find that happy medium. Also, if you come to the position where you're ever an employer, you have to weigh the consequences of overworking your employees. So in that, there is a peak or a limit to human productivity. I would allow you to think about this in terms of a schedule. You should be thinking about this from both the standpoint of the employee and the employer. This is a picture of me last week. Actually, that's not me. That's just a guy like me. Work tends to pile up, especially when people have time commitments. They have things going on in their personal lives. They have a lot of things going on at work. Especially in a construction environment where we deal with, at least on the office side, a huge amount of paper. Things do have a tendency to pile up. It can lead you to become more constrained with time management, and the idea, at least in concept, is to control this, to have an organized system to stay on top of this. And every once in a while we get in a position where we're a little bit behind. So obviously my encouragement would be not to be like me, like this fella right here, and not to get behind. And in the grander scheme of productivity, obviously, to stay on top of the paperwork. How can you manage your stress? I think certain stressors are beyond our control. So you can sort of change how you react to stress. There are stressful situations, and you don't necessarily need to react in a construction environment where there's a whole heck of a lot of time, money, pressure, and sometimes you will encounter an abrasive personality. It is kind of up to you how to change how you react to stress. One of the things we can do is avoid extremes. So if we're working 80 hours a week, obviously that's not ideal. I think most people will reach their limit for productivity well in advance of 80 hours per week. So burning the candle at both ends, so to speak, is obviously a way to avoid too much stress. On the flip side of that, which we hardly ever encounter in a construction environment, having not enough to do, I don't think we need to necessarily worry about that extreme, but definitely having too much to do is a situation we encounter from time to time. This one is perhaps most important of all, I think, in terms of setting realistic goals for ourselves. And this was part of the Articulate a Goal project, is when you map out or you schedule or you plan to meet an objective, you realize fairly quickly whether it's realistic or not. Setting unrealistic goals, also by contrast, often leads to failure. So if I'm not planning to achieve things, or if I'm not laying a roadmap for myself, there's a good chance I won't achieve the goal. So one way of determining whether a goal is realistic or not is to see or to plan it out. Setting priorities. So we'll talk about this a little bit later. Obviously, some things are more important than others. If you've learned anything from scheduling this semester, you will have learned that the critical path method identifies what's most critical and what should be considered a priority. Taking control of the situation, sometimes easier said than done, especially if you're looking at the guy's desk in the previous slide. Sometimes we have we get overwhelmed with work, but taking control of that work obviously will alleviate some of the stress. Figuring out what's most important, that's probably falls in line with setting priorities. I think at a certain point you have to balance your personal life with your professional life, so all of these kind of should be couched within that context. I think as we're all human beings, we do have social lives outside of work. Some of us have families, so we do have to figure out what's most important with respect to how we manage our stress. Ultimately, what you guys do or will be doing in a contracting situation or a construction management situation, or even if you work for a subcontractor, is to avoid being put in the seat on the left. It's not the place any of us really want to end up, but when we have disagreements with respect to construction cost, and particularly with respect to construction schedule, things do tend to get litigious. As a matter of fact, a lot of what you will be doing as an office person, a staff office person in a construction company, even if you're project manager or project engineer or assistant project manager or project executive, is compiling the paperwork necessary to avoid ever having to sit in that seat. So a lot of the stuff we do can be categorized as claims avoidance. If we're talking about stress, this is absolutely the last place you want to be. And so a lot of what we do should be geared towards avoiding this, because this is the ultimate step in determining who's right and who's wrong. I do have another concept that's related to the stuff we've talked about, but also this is more of like a legal concept. So contractor created float is when a general contractor or a subcontractor performs at a faster pace than planned. More float may be added to the remainder of the schedule, and it can and often is referred to as contractor created float. But there are some interesting questions that arise from this type of scenario. One is who owns the float. So we got three parties I think that would be the most likely. Is it the subcontractor who performed at a faster rate than baseline? Is it the contractor who basically supervises the work of the subcontractor, or is it actually the owner's float? So there's a number of different ways of looking at that. You can probably spell that out in the contract. It is nice to have some discretion as construction manager to have that flexibility given back to you, but again, you're working for somebody else at the end of the day. Question is, can it be taken back at a later juncture? Can you sort of shift it around? Do you have the ability to utilize that extra float? I will say, in the same way that when you get behind schedule, getting ahead of schedule has the tendency to make more successor activities come off of the critical path. So in the same way that when you get behind schedule, compresses and more activities become critical, the opposite happens when you do things ahead of schedule. So it is kind of an ideal situation. The other question that might arise out of this is who gets the bonus for fast performance, and I would argue that would be more often than not the general contractor. It's probably spelled out in the contract. I think there may be performance incentives for quick performance for subcontractors at certain points. Ultimately, the owner would have to agree to that, and the owners often do spell out some kind of performance incentive in the contract. So flip side of that, just as a general contractor and subcontractors can perform at a faster rate than scheduled, they can also perform at a slower pace than scheduled. The one thing that everybody needs to remember, however, is that the schedule is a contract document and it is legally binding. So your inability to keep pace with a schedule, it ultimately can land you in court if you're unable to perform at a certain rate. So deviations from baseline. We already know that you can get an incentive for accelerated performance, and those are often built in to the contract. We also know that you can incur penalties for inadequate performance. So that can be the quality of the work, speed, or both. And I've seen, drywall work in particular where the subcontractor might be doing piecework, paying workers to by the amount that they produce per day without necessarily worrying about quality. And it has to, at the end of the day, it has to be accepted. So we can't. Quality is definitely a prerequisite to any kind of schedule performance. The last part of this talks about outside of a perfectly synchronized schedule, assuming they exist in the sordid world of construction claims, how can subcontractors be compelled to adhere to a schedule with known and fully anticipated deviations? And what that means is there are going to be ups and downs in a construction schedule. I don't think the perfectly synchronized construction schedule exists. So, with respect to what we've learned about resource leveling, managing multiple contracts, for example, where that becomes crucially important. If I'm a subcontractor and I've got 5 crews and the general contractor is deviating from baseline, I need to have a way to compel that subcontractor to adhere to what they've agreed to with respect to a duration. So a lot of that is going to be spelled out in a contract with respect to acceleration, overtime. The word reasonable is often thrown about in construction contracts, but I do have to have a way to be able to compel that contractor to perform at a given time and a specific duration. The best way, I would say, of doing that is to keep the subcontractor abreast of every single change or deviation from the schedule. Every time the schedule changes, it needs to go out to each and every subcontractor. Anytime it deviates, that contractor needs to be apprised of the situation. So in that way, there's no surprises. The subcontractor should be given ample opportunity to modify their schedule, level their resources, and so forth, even if it's a period of months. So your best companion or your best supporting documentation for this is just to compile as much communication, documentation, communication with that subcontractor as possible, so that you can demonstrate that you have been open and communicative and have told that contractor when and where they need to be. Every once in a while we get into supplementing work, and this is where it gets kind of nasty, because you're basically taking money out of somebody's contract and giving it to somebody else. So should a subcontractor delay the contractor, any other subcontractor, anyone else on the project, that subcontractor will indemnify the contractor and hold the contractor harmless for any damages, claims, demands, liens, stop notices, lawsuits, attorney's fees, and other costs or liabilities imposed on the contractor connected with said delay by subcontractor. So in amongst other remedies, I have the ability to supplement the subcontractor's work and deduct the associated cost at my discretion. So if somebody's underperforming, I find out they're 2 weeks behind. I also find out that their crews are committed elsewhere. They've delayed me 2 weeks. I do have the ability to go out, write another contract, and hire another crew from another subcontractor to finish the part of the work that my original subcontractor was not able to finish on time. It gets obviously it's kind of a confrontational process, but again, if I've got a contract to back it up, and I've got somebody who's willfully and unable to perform as required by the contract, I do have that option of going out and hiring additional work. It is kind of a pain. I do have to write another contract. I do have to vet that subcontractor. So there is definitely a paper side to that doesn't happen instantaneously. But if somebody's really dragging me down by underperforming, I can supplement their work. You'll hear the term liquidated damages quite often. Usually these are spelled out in the contract. I want to say most of the time these relate to breaches in schedule. So in the larger scheme of things, This refers to a breach of any type in the contract. So what are they? They're amount of money that contracting parties agree to on as the amount of damages one of them can recover if the party breaches the contract. Usually they apply to some specific type of breach of the contract, not any breach of promise anywhere in the contract. So you most often see liquidated damages apply when the contractor breaches the contract by not finishing the work on time. That's why it's a scheduling related term. So if, for example, I have a subcontractor again who's a month behind and is costing me or is incurring some kind of penalty for me, I do have the ability to basically write into the contract an associated penalty for not finishing a certain portion of the work on time and so forth. So you'll hear that term from time to time. Again, this is more contractual type of language, but it does relate to the schedule more often than not. So when I talk about supplementing work, when I talk about liquidated damages, these are also the precursors to mediation, arbitration, and ultimately litigation. So you have to be very careful about these terms to the point where, if I get far enough behind schedule, the point is there are legal consequences to that. How do I avoid extremes? So one way would be not to commit to overly aggressive schedules or to a work that is beyond your capacity. And that's actually easier said than done. From smaller contractors to larger contractors, I think the larger contractors are going to have a much better sense of what is overly aggressive and what's not. Subcontractors, I want to say, are going to have maybe a little different sense of this. There are big subcontractors out there. You look at Baker Concrete, for example. They specialize in concrete work. They have a tremendous amount of capacity to perform large scale concrete work. Oftentimes this will kind of be built in with some kind of bonding capacity. So in order to be bonded, you have to have a demonstration or a demonstrable ability to perform at a certain level or at a certain capacity. For smaller family-owned subcontractors, this can be harder to delimit. If you think about it, might be just like a specialty subcontractor who's trying to work on the biggest job they ever received in the history of the company, and from week one they get left behind because they're unaccustomed to the scale. Same thing, any other trade would have that same situation, but sometimes subcontractors don't have the capacity and get awarded a contract that they're not able to perform at an adequate speed. Government work is, I want to say, an area where this type of work happens, because oftentimes in government work we award the contract to the lowest qualified bidder, and the qualifications are hard to determine. So sometimes when somebody's got the low bid, we worry less about whether they're actually qualified or not, without worrying about is it going to affect the schedule later on. So it is important to establish qualifications. It is important to establish if somebody has the capacity to finish a contract on time. How do I set realistic goals? Well, we had an exercise earlier in the semester of articulating a goal, so that is perhaps the best exercise anybody can do to figure out whether they're going to be able to achieve something or not. You do need to weigh your goals with your capabilities. Again, sometimes you just simply may not be able to dedicate the amount of time, effort. Maybe it's just completely beyond the scale of what you're able to do. In terms of, from a business owner's perspective, and especially in a boom economy, people tend to take on too much too soon. This can be investment in equipment, investment in additional personnel. Personnel are actually pretty easy to bring on and lay off, but business investments like buying additional equipment, buying additional facilities, those are a little bit harder to liquidate. Balance. If you articulated the goal, you should understand the associated time requirements. Again, I think this is either plan to fail or fail to plan. How do I set priorities? So in an emergency room, it's referred to as triage. and they have a dedicated protocol as to who requires treatment first. Should have that same thing in a construction environment. So the schedule usually holds a lot of the answers unless it was poorly conceived to begin with, and that's the other thing that you might be careful of is it is important that you understand how the schedule works, simply because you should be able to figure out whether the schedule was well put together to begin with. We have talked in this class about typical processes or typical sequences of activities relative to the construction of buildings. For example, starting with underground foundation, utility work, building the substructure and foundation, then moving on to the structure, to the roof, drying the building in, putting a roof on it, windows, doors, getting air conditioning in as quickly as possible, and then going full speed ahead with the finishes. So a lot of, we should have a basic concept of how a building goes together. We should also be able to pinpoint, if it is a well-conceived schedule, where the critical path lies, and that's really setting priorities all by itself. Another way to set priorities is actually to verify progress every day to avoid getting behind, and for the purposes of documenting the source of delay. So again, no irony intended here, but on a construction schedule, if I'm able to walk out every day and see how much work the drywall sub's done, or if that's the HVAC, how much duct work did they install, how much did they insulate. One, I get a better sense of where the project is with respect to the schedule. Two, I'm able to get a better handle on how much work that sub will want to bill for the end of the monthly cycle. So verifying progress on a daily basis is crucial. What if I'm still behind? The schedule still tells you a lot of what needs to be done. As a matter of fact, you should be recalculating your schedule each week, doing smaller increments like 3-week look-aheads. You should be able to pinpoint which, if any, subs are holding you up. So a lot of times the schedule holds the answers. So how do I take control of the situation? We talk about planning and scheduling. Actually, what we're really talking about is control. So these are all related concepts. What you want to do, obviously, is create a realistic schedule and a plan of attack and stick to it. In the extent you're not able to do that, we do have corrective measures that can be taken. Scheduling control requires you to stay up to date with every on-site development and subcontractor progress. So we do have dedicated personnel going out and verifying subcontractor progress every day. The other thing I would caution you to do is, if you haven't verified progress for yourself, you have ceded control to somebody else. And from time to time, there is a discord between the field and the office. If you're a steel stud project manager and you rarely go to the office, there's a good chance that your your superintendent is controlling the schedule on that project, meaning that you're just relying on what they're giving you in the way of information. And sometimes that's not always the best information. You do need to go verify the information for yourself. How do I figure out what's most important? Look at the critical path. We will talk about material expediting log here for the final project, which will be coming out within the week. I should be looking for opportunities to accelerate. Cleaning, this sounds so minor, but it is extremely helpful. A clean job site is an efficient job site. So really, if I am looking for ways to accelerate, I can dedicate a cleaning crew to go in and make sure the site's clear so that people can move and go and come as they please. I might even take on some of the site prep for new subcontractors. So I can tell you, I think we just got, maybe a couple days extra or a couple hours extra with a particular sub, structural steel sub, just by going out and cleaning off the concrete off of anchor bolts, and basically making sure that all the bolts and all that were working, ready for them to just simply set the steel. So they didn't have to do any of that work themselves. We did it ourselves, and we gained, maybe like 4-6 hours. It can be of enough consequence to go ahead and do it. We talked about coordination and communication a little bit before. Hugely important. I need to keep everybody up to date. This is also a way I can avoid keeping myself out of a courtroom, is just simply to communicate effectively with where things are at. You do have to, I think we talked about the cost, time cost benefit trade-off earlier in a different PowerPoint. There are added costs for accelerating a schedule, but there are also those contractual incentives, so you do have to weigh those two against one another. Is just by performing faster doesn't mean it's going to be an effective strategy for making more money ultimately on the bottom line. Your activity for this week is as follows. I would like you to write a one-page discussion on this. I don't want this on the discussion board. I simply want your thoughts on a piece of paper. So given what you know about scheduling, CPM, precedence, resource allocation, planning, documentation, control, etc., what would you do about the following scenario? You're 3 months behind schedule. You're within 2 weeks of completing foundation work and would like to move on to the structural steel. The steel stub has told you that he cannot put his crew on site when you need them, as they have been committed elsewhere. You tell him that will further delay the project. He responds by stating that the revised start date deviates from the original start date by 3 months, the same 3 months that you were behind schedule. What should you do? Is there anything in the sub's contract that compels him to show up? Is there anything you should have done differently? What are your possible remedies? Most importantly, what documentation should you be able to produce to compel this sub to work? So again, I'll be looking for a single page discussion. I will open up a Dropbox for this particular purpose, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. This is not an uncommon situation. You need to think about ways in which you can avoid having this sub control the schedule. So whatever paperwork, whatever document you can produce to do that, it's in your best interest.